Hello everyone, and welcome to episode 118. If you're just joining us in this series on the myriapods, let me give you a brief recap. In the first episode of this series, we explored the early evolution of the myriapods, their biodiversity and their fossil record, or perhaps the lack thereof. In the second episode, we explored the Symphyla and the Pauropoda, sister clades from an ancient lineage that diverged very early in myriapod evolutionary history. The third episode of the series was a special episode. We stepped back to look at the soil biome generally. After all, the soil biome is where virtually all the myriapods live, as well as tons of other stuff like microbes, protozoa, fungi, plants, mollusks, annelids, arthropods, and more. That special episode was a behemoth. That takes us to where we are now, on the fourth episode of this series on the myriapods. We'll be returning our attention to the next major myriapod lineage, and so our focus today will be on the diplopods, the millipedes, that roam around the soil and the leaf litter, breaking down plant detritus and serving as a critical food resource for larger vertebrates in the food chain. Now, before I get lost in a tangent on their ecology, let's begin with a brief look at their evolutionary history. This should also serve as a good launch point to get into their physiology, their behavior, their life cycle, all that fun stuff. Now, the first millipedes appear in the fossil record about 428 million years ago, although it's very probable that they had existed for several million, maybe even tens of millions of years before that. For example, the oldest millipede specimen, the one that's 428 million years old, has evidence of spiracles and a complete trachea network for breathing air, implying at least some previous evolutionary history wherein those features had to have been developed. And that adaptation process, as these creatures move on to dry land from their marine origins, that adaptation process can take a while, millions of years in some cases. Recent molecular data suggests that the diplopods emerged first, and their sister lineage, the chylopods, or the centipedes, evolved shortly after them. It's likely that their common ancestor existed sometime around 450 million years ago, with some estimates as late as 475 million years ago, although lots of early myriapod species were emerging and going extinct around this time, so it's really difficult to trace the lineage back and identify actual ancestor species. In any case, from what limited amount the fossil record tells us, there were aquatic myriapod ancestor species creeping around in the late Ordovician oceans around 430 to 450 million years ago. And then after that, after about 430 million years ago or so in the early Silurian, the only myriapod fossils we've found are those of terrestrial millipedes and centipedes. In other words, all of the marine myriapod ancestors seem to have disappeared. To make matters worse, the fossil record is frustratingly mute on that critical period of transition, when the myriapods moved onto dry land and diverged into different clades with distinct physiologies and life strategies. No fossils from that time period have been recovered with an intact respiratory organ, like gills or lungs, or a spiracle and trachea system, or something which would give us some insight into what was happening and when. What we do know is that sometime between 428 and 414 million years ago, in the mid to late Silurian period, an early offshoot species of these ancestral millipedes, known as Pneumodesmus pneumani, existed. The fact that Pneumodesmus pneumani possesses clear spiracles and trachea to breathe dry air is strong evidence that it lived on dry land, and this makes it the first known terrestrial animal, at least the first known macroscopic terrestrial animal. Pneumodesmus pneumani likely stayed near riparian zones, near lakes and coastal areas, where it had access to water and perpetually moist soil, and ample fields of plant detritus and leaf litter. After all, this dry land was untapped by any other animal. It was home to nothing else but great mats of bacteria, fields of fungi including the towering prototaxites, and primitive plant communities. Just try to visualize this. It's 430 million years ago, in the middle of the Silurian period. The climate is warm and humid. The Ordovician ice sheets had receded almost completely, with all of the meltwater raising sea levels to their near maximum extent. At times, these were floods from the coast into the depths of the flat supercontinent Gondwana. These created numerous shallow lakes and other inland bodies of water across the relatively flat landscape. The organic-rich soils were still relatively new, at least from our Cenozoic perspective, but there was enough to sustain small plant and fungal-based ecosystems. Mosses, hornworts, and other primitive land plants like emergent lycophytes hugged the water-softened land near these bodies of water, creating dense carpets of vegetation that could be explored and tunneled through by the early millipedes. Coincidentally, 428 million years ago is about as old as the lycophytes, which might suggest that both the ferns and the terrestrial millipedes evolved at about the same time, and they may have developed some sort of early symbiotic relationship. This relationship would have helped both of them proliferate, which would explain some of their early success in this terrestrial environment. Now, all of these small ecosystems would produce a primitive equivalent to leaf litter, but owing to the small size of these plants and some of these other organisms, it would just be a thin layer that built up very slowly. But the plants have had at least 50 million years to work on this before any arthropods show up, so by the time the millipedes colonized dry land, there was already a modest soil layer with Silurian humus and an above-ground environment dominated by simple plants and the reigning fungi. This habitat was home to countless bacteria, protozoans, and quite possibly a growing ecosystem of microfauna. Food was plentiful, the air was rich in oxygen, and best of all, for a brief time, there were no predators anywhere. They simply had not appeared on land yet, or they had not yet evolved. This age of relative calm, this period of peace, if you will, would not last forever. In relatively short order, the centipedes would emerge, having evolved a more carnivorous lifestyle to become among the first ever terrestrial animal predators. The centipedes hunted the millipedes, and as this early terrestrial animal food chain developed over the eons, they soon came to prey on all manner of other soil-dwelling arthropods and invertebrates, downregulating the size of their populations and the size of their adult body forms. Another early millipede predator that emerged around the mid to late Silurian were the trigonotarbids, an arachnid group that was similar to spiders but without silk. These trigonotarbids were generally small, no larger than a few centimeters, and they preyed on even smaller arthropods, like many of the early millipedes. The millipedes were among the first animals in this emerging food chain, and they were a major participant in some of the earliest predator-prey dynamics, in their case on the side of prey. As a result, or consequence of this dynamic, the millipedes were also the first terrestrial animals to evolve chemical defense mechanisms. This is evident with the presence of ozophores in the Devonian period fossils. These ozophores are small holes at specific points in the exoskeleton, where they connect to internal glands. These glands, called ozodines, produce a wide variety of toxic chemicals that are used to irritate, injure, and repel potential predators. This is a super cool trait, but I'll get into more detail on this later. Throughout the Devonian period and into the Carboniferous, various families of millipedes grew to enormous sizes, many of them over a meter long. Try to visualize a millipede the length of your leg, from hip to heel, with a body as wide as your hand, and that's a good approximation. Some species grew even larger, like those in the Arthroplura genus. For example, there are shed exoskeletons from 340 to 280 million years ago that are 2 to 2.5 meters long and half a meter wide. It's basically a millipede the size of a large grown man in a sleeping bag. The largest known arthropleura ever is 2.63 meters long and estimated to weigh approximately 50 kilograms. That's 110 pounds of late Paleozoic arthropod monster, although they were presumably herbivorous detrivores, like almost all of the other millipedes. At such enormous sizes, these arthropleura millipedes would have required a ton of food, more than they could have practically consumed if they relied just on vegetable detritus alone. It's speculated that their diet was unusually varied for a millipede, including roots, seeds, and the spore-bearing leaves of the lycophytes, the ferns, which would have been common at the time. For comparison, the largest modern millipede, the largest species alive today, is the giant African millipede Archospirostreptus gigas, known regionally as shangololo. The largest specimens of this species are about 1/3 of a meter, or barely more than 1 foot long, and about as thick as your thumb. To put this another way, the largest millipedes to ever live were 8 times bigger than the largest millipedes alive today. The ancient arthropleura were not just the largest millipedes ever, they were also the largest terrestrial invertebrates to ever live, anywhere in the world, at any time throughout evolutionary history. In fact, they were so large that there may not have been any comparable predators that were capable of handling them or injuring them. These arthropleura survived tens of millions of years, even surviving the Carboniferous rainforest collapse that led to the extinction of so many other species. It's suspected that these giant millipedes were finally wiped out when they came to the attention of newly emerged tetrapod predators, or carnivorous vertebrate animals, like the super-primitive proto-mammalian sphenacodontids. These are the creatures that look like a vague combination of crocodile, dog, and dinosaur, with a very recognizable fan or sail, or giant webbed fin protruding up from their spine. Okay, so we have ozophores and giant body size as defensive properties or deterrents against predation. Another defensive strategy that the millipedes pioneered was burrowing through the leaf litter, through the underbrush and the looser, less compacted upper layers of the soil to hide and escape from pursuing predators. The millipedes thrived in this detrital leaf litter soil habitat. They diverged and spread out and adapted to new environments and new predators. Over millions of years, as the divergences and the radiations continued, the ranks of the class Diplopoda swelled with thousands of new species. Today, there's about 12,000 known species of millipedes, although it's estimated that this may be anywhere from 80% to a mere 15% of all millipede species on Earth. If the 12,000 known millipede species really are just 15% of all the millipede species on Earth, then going with some quick back-of-the-napkin math here, that means the highest estimates for total number of millipede species on Earth is somewhere around 70 to 80,000. But even if we're just looking at the 12,000 known and described species, that's more than the centipedes, and it's definitely more than either the Pauropoda or the Symphyla. Now, the general millipede body plan has remained largely unchanged throughout their evolutionary history, with only a few tweaks around the edges. For example, one of the most characteristic features of the millipedes, one which is really useful when you're trying to identify ancient ancestral fossilized millipedes, are their diplosegments. Now in the centipedes, for example, there's just one pair of legs attached to each body segment. It's pretty simple and straightforward. But in the millipedes, the arrangement of the legs and the body segments is a little more complicated. the first segment after the head has no legs. It's called a column because it's kind of like an armored collar piece with no other ornamentation or appendages. Some millipedes also have a few blank segments like this at the very end of their body, like the terminal 2 or 3 segments. But anyway, after the column segment immediately behind the head, the 3 following segments each host a single pair of legs. But after this, all of the following body segments are fused in pairs, so segments 4 and 5, 6 and 7, segments 8 and 9, and so on. All these pairs of segments are fused at some point in embryological development, creating the diplo segments. Each diplo segment hosts 2 pairs of legs, which is a result of the exoskeletal plate segments fusing but retaining the same number of points or nodes for leg development. This results in a millipede with almost 4 times as many legs as it has diplo segments. Most millipedes have between 34 and 400 legs, but some species have more than this, like the Myriapods with 750 legs. In a somewhat counterintuitive turn of events, the millipede name means 1,000 legs or 1,000 feet, but only one species has more than 1,000 legs, the Millipedes Persephone, a long, thin, pale, and blind millipede that lives exclusively in the soil, which is why it's named after Persephone, the Greek goddess of the underworld. Despite having all these legs, or perhaps due to having all of these short little legs, the millipedes are slow. They aren't designed for sprinting or moving at high speed. They're designed for ponderously scuttling across the landscape and punching tunnels through the soil. Some millipedes dig their tunnels through brute force. They simply push themselves into the soil and separate the soil particles with the sheer, steady force of their advance. Other species take a more strategic approach to their digging, either to conserve energy or dig faster, or to form certain types of burrows. For example, the wedge approach involves sticking the head or the forward section of the body into a crevice, and then crawling up with the lower section of the body to lift up or move the crevice material with their back. They basically use the anterior portion of their bodies, like the joint on a lever, to move the soil. And yet other species have retained the brute force method, but their head and anterior regions have evolved to have a more conical shape, so that the digging surface is more aerodynamic. Soil dynamic? Not sure what you'd call that, but the conical head and mouth parts allow them to bore into the soil, as opposed to just bulldozing it. Now, if you look at the individual sections or component segments within each of the millipede's diplo segments, you'll quickly notice that they're often not identical. For example, in some species, each diplo segment has a first section or a first component segment that's narrow, smooth, and usually unadorned, followed by a second section or a second component segment that's often thicker, larger, and wider. Sometimes it hosts the origin of both pairs of legs in the diplo segment, and sometimes they're modified with various features, like paranota. These are like frills, or ridges, or edges, or overhanging extensions of the exoskeletal armor, kind of like eaves on a roof. The paranota body part shows wide diversity across species. This mantle-like armor plating extending from the diplo segments and covering the top and some of the sides of the body may have different shapes or textures, or various features like spines or bumps or crevices. These features work like hardpoints that the millipedes can use to push or brace against the sides of a tunnel, to help them burrow through the substrate by shoveling it around, or maneuvering around a tight or twisting section of the tunnel corridor. Similarly, the paranota can be used like anchors to help wedge the millipede into a crevice while trying to avoid predators. Or if the millipede is getting pulled out of its hiding hole, the paranota can be used as hooks or toe holds to hang on to something, like a rock or a plant root. Even in cases where the situation turns particularly desperate, the paranota can come in handy. For example, the millipede might be swallowed alive, like it might be if it was captured by a bird or a frog. If the millipede is large enough, it can use the peronata to wedge itself in place inside the esophagus and make it extremely difficult to swallow. If that millipede is very, very lucky, if it's large enough, if it has the right shape and texture to its peronata, and it manages to successfully get itself wedged in the throat somewhere, this little maneuver can injure and frighten the predator and cause it to regurgitate the millipede. In extreme cases, the millipede may be blocking the predator's airway. It may start to choke and die, and the millipede, if it's uninjured, may be able to crawl out of the mouth of the corpse and escape. Of course, being coated in caustic chemicals can help with that, what with their slimy secretions burning the inside of the animal's esophagus. The millipede's head anatomy is also somewhat unique and unusual. Instead of pointing forward, as most heads and faces do, the millipede's head curls downward, so that at rest, its face and its mouth are pointing downwards, towards the ground. A plethora of mouthparts and sensors protrude from the head to investigate the ground immediately in front of and below the millipede. The segmented antennae reach out to the side, and then bend forward or downward, like a pair of arms with a moderate flexion at the elbow. Along the edges of the segments near the tip of the antenna, there are sensitive tissues that provide tactile feedback to the millipede. There's also an enigmatic pair of sensory structures nested at the base of the antenna, called Tomasvari organs. These are believed to play some sort of role in sensing environmental conditions, like the amount of daylight, or the local humidity, or vibrations in the soil. But if it's not clear, we don't know for sure. Curiously, there's many species of centipedes, and even some hexapods, that also have Tomasvari organs, but the polydesmids, the largest order of millipedes, don't have them at all. To this day, Tomasvari organs remain somewhat of an understudied mystery, even though they were discovered in 1883. Another millipede oddity is their sense of hearing. They don't have any. They don't have ears. They don't even have brain regions to detect and interpret sound. They don't perceive audio at all. They're a class of arthropod that is completely deaf. As far as their vision is concerned, millipedes generally do not have a good sense of sight. Their eyes are rudimentary and relatively undeveloped. A cluster of light-sensitive cells are packed underneath a single, flat lens. They can't form high-detail images of their environment, and for the most part, all they really can see is patterns of light and darkness in the wider world, and maybe some finer details of the ground immediately in front of them, but that's about it. Many millipedes, much like their symphylan and pauropod cousins, have evolved to lose their eyes, and thus they're completely blind. This usually happens in clades that live in complete darkness, like the Trichopetalum cave-dwelling millipedes. Other groups have lost their eyes simply because they don't need them, or they need to invest the nutrient and chemical energy into some other more productive trait. For example, the polydesmids that I mentioned a minute ago are the largest order of millipedes, with over 3,500 species. They live in the darkness of the leaf litter, and they've all gone blind through the loss of their eyes. However, many species are poisonous. They produce a wide variety of caustic chemicals, including hydrogen cyanide, and their carapaces are often coated with bright colors like orange or yellow to warn predators of their toxicity and discourage them from attacking the millipede. This may seem like a foolproof advantage, but some millipede predators have evolved ways around this. Some mammal predators, like meerkats, have learned to roll the millipedes around in the dirt and the dust. This dries them out and mops up their toxic secretions so that they're eventually safe to eat. The meerkats and the other mammals that do this to millipedes are quickly turning the millipedes into millipede beef jerky. Coming back around to millipede head anatomy, their mouthparts include a pair of large mandibles and a lower lip-like structure called a gnathocylarium. This lower lip structure is heavily innervated, making it a powerful sensory structure. And it's not just tactilely sensitive, but also chemosensitive, so in that sense, it's kind of more like a tongue than a lower lip. In a really weird surprise, this gnathochilarium is also integrated with excretory nephridial organs that remove nitrogenous wastes. This is super strange, because why on earth would waste organs open up into the head and mouth area? That seems like a really easy way to foul up the eyes and the other sensory organs, but apparently this is a result of the complex idiosyncrasies and cellular growth patterns of arthropod embryogenesis, and the millipedes make it work somehow. The human equivalent to this would be peeing out of your tongue, and I really don't think that humans would make that work. In any case, these overdeveloped mandibles and the gnathochilarium are used to find and scrape up food, which is usually plant detritus, fungi, animal waste, and clumps of heavily decayed organic matter scattered in the soil. This is where the millipedes make one of their major contributions to the local ecology. When plants lose their leaves, or their herbaceous tissues otherwise die and fall to the ground, they can take some time to decompose. The millipedes accelerate this decomposition process by chewing through the leaf litter, mechanically destroying it and shredding it to ribbons. This consumed plant matter, once digested, gets excreted in pellets full of bacteria and fungi, which are able to more rapidly break down the plant tissue now that it's been all torn and ripped up by the millipede, and its surface area has been massively increased. Just by being chewed up and going through a millipede, the vegetation becomes so much easier to decay and turn into bioaccessible nutrients for fungi and plants and other organisms. The millipedes accelerate the decay process, enriching the soil and making the habitat more fertile for other organisms. There's some variation here too. Millipedes aren't just all detrivores. Many species are true herbivores that eat living plant tissues, like roots, root hairs, and herbaceous stems, leaves, and petals. Some species, like most of those in the small Siphonophorida order, have mouthparts that are more conical or beak-like in shape. This is to facilitate suction, to suck nutrients and fluids out of their food. Some of these suctorial millipedes feed on fungi, where they can use their pseudoprobisci to tap into a hyphae or mycelial mass and suck out the watery, mineral-rich fluids inside, as if the fungi were some kind of go-gurt or otter pop. Other species of suctorial millipede feed in a similar way on root hairs, while others tap into leaves and bark to get phloem and sap. A very small number of millipedes are omnivores, or, even more rare, are outright carnivores. These predatory millipedes have fine hairs on their legs, which help them detect the vibrations of prey animals in the nearby soil. Their prey include all manner of small, soil-bound invertebrates, like tiny arthropods, squirming annelids, wriggling mollusks, and even smaller millipedes. Although this is super rare, there are very few carnivorous millipedes. After all, this is an ecological niche that's already largely dominated by centipedes. In contrast, the millipedes are prey for a wide variety of larger animals, including all kinds of vertebrates and many larger predatory invertebrates. Centipedes are the classic millipede predator, a Cain and Abel-style relationship between evolutionary siblings, where one sibling tills the soil, while the other sibling hunts and preys upon the first. There's a lot of different vertebrates that prey on millipedes, and because of this, the millipedes are put in a very interesting position in the food web. As the millipedes break down plant matter and help recycle nutrients back into the soil, and as they're consumed by vertebrates, which are some of the largest and most complex animals, the millipedes thus act as a critical pathway by which nutrients in the physical environment can be transitioned into a biological substrate and passed into the larger ecosystem. For example, millipedes don't have much muscle mass, so they're not particularly rich in protein. Because their diet is largely plant detritus, that's usually all that's in their guts, too. And again, that's not that rich in protein. But their bodies are particularly good at extracting and storing calcium from plant detritus and root hairs and whatnot, and this is used to enrich and strengthen their exoskeleton. Among many other predators, there are many birds that feed heavily, mostly or even entirely, off of millipedes, and their exoskeletons are a super nutritious source of calcium. The bird digests the millipede, absorbs it as nutrients, and uses those nutrients for other body functions, like maintaining bone mass or building eggshells. In fact, research has found that a huge portion of the calcium in a bird's eggshell comes from arthropods like millipedes in the mother bird's diet. Because the millipedes are preyed upon by such a wide variety of animals, they were desperate to evolve any kind of defenses against any of them, or all of them. They burrow to hide, to escape predators, but if this isn't feasible, they'll typically curl up into a ball or a spiral, where the hard dorsal carapace protects the delicate legs and the soft underbelly. And I already mentioned the paranota, which help the millipede maneuver through the environment and avoid capture. The most fascinating defense the millipedes have evolved against predators are the ozophores and the ozapine glands. I mentioned these earlier, but now I'll get into a bit more detail. The ozophores are the points from where toxic and caustic chemicals are secreted, which often cover the entire millipede in a protective coating that discourages predation. Much like the venoms found in spiders and scorpions, and the poisons found in frogs, the toxins in millipedes are chemically diverse and include stuff like hydrogen cyanide, as well as a wide range of terpenoids, alkaloids, and benzoquinones, like various 2-nitroethinyl benzyl compounds. These caustic chemical mixtures are capable of inflicting horrible, maiming, or even fatal wounds on small arthropods like ants and little beetles, and they can cause intense irritation to the eyes and the mucous membranes of larger predators. They also appear to have some antimicrobial and antifungal properties as well, which implies they have a role in the immune system too. It might seem like the millipedes really don't like ants, as a lot of their chemical defenses are designed to hurt them, and the very few carnivorous millipedes out there often include ants as their primary food source. But many millipedes actually coexist with ants. They form symbiotic food-sharing relationships with ants, and some species may even live in the ant colonies, where the millipede's waste is a nice supplement for the ants and any ant symbiotic fungi out there in the soil. Other symbioses have been observed. For example, there are some groups of mites who don't parasitize the millipede, but instead they ride on it. They use it like a bus or a train to move across large distances and spread throughout a habitat. An extremely interesting symbiosis can be seen in the species Semodesmus bryophorus. These are dark-colored millipedes with thick, jagged, and sharply pointed paranota, which live above the soil on small plants and in tree bark, usually about a meter or so off the ground. In this moderately elevated, plant-centric habitat, the Semodesmus bryophorus needs camouflage that helps them blend into the green leaves and tree bark. To do this, they've evolved a symbiosis with many species of moss and other bryophytes. These grow on their back and obscure them from predators looking down. And in return, the mosses and the bryophytes get to ride around in the millipede, where they can be exposed to more nutrients in the air and in rainwater. Among all the millipedes, there's a tremendous amount of diversity, not just in their behavior and life strategies, or in their shape and function of specific body parts, but also in their overall body plan too. For example, consider the primitive Polyzonida millipedes. These are one of the oldest branches on the Diplopod family tree known to science, having originally diverged before many now extinct millipede species ever existed. In other words, the Polyzonida order is a sister group to all of the other millipedes. As a result, they retain many primitive features, and they've developed a host of their own unique traits. The millipedes of the Polyzonida order are generally small and short, with relatively few body segments, and usually just 11 pairs of legs, although no species has more than 17 pairs of legs. And among the millipedes, this is a really small number. This is very few pairs of legs. Their exoskeletons are uncalcified, meaning they're soft and flexible, but they provide much less mechanical protection. The Polyzonida also lack ozophores and the associated ozapine glands and their caustic chemicals. The Polyzonida diverged from the main line before these features were developed, so they just never got them. Instead, they've evolved a mechanical defense in the form of bristles. The 159 known species of Polyzonida are also called bristly or pincushion millipedes, because they have these dense tufts of stiff, barbed bristles protruding from each body segment. These bristles are used for self-defense, in a similar way to the setae on certain spiders. The bristles easily break off and can get ensnared in the hairs, limbs, mouthparts, mucous membranes, and eyes of potential predators. Another detail that reveals the ancient origins of the Polyzonida are their reproductive habits. Sexual reproduction is indirect, in the sense that males will construct a spermatophore and then leave it behind somewhere in a web of pheromone-laden secretions for a female to find and put in her genital pore. Although it should be noted that a significant portion of Polyzonida don't have any males at all. The females just reproduce asexually through parthenogenesis. This is quite distinct from the way that every other millipede species reproduces. That is, every millipede group besides the Polyzonida reproduces sexually with male and female participants. The male has 1 or 2 pairs of legs that have been adapted into sexual organs called gonopods. The gonopods work either as the penis, or they work in conjunction with a smaller separate penis organ on the third body segment to transfer sperm to the female. Notice the evolutionary forces at work here. If the male builds a spermatophore for a female to find, they don't need a penis because there's never a moment where the male and female meet and physically engage. Same with species that reproduce through parthenogenesis. But in species that do sexually reproduce and use in-person internal fertilization, you may have up to 4 penis-like structures per individual, depending on the species. The gonopods develop over the course of the millipede's life. Males aren't born with any gonopods. No, instead, the pairs of legs that will become the gonopods do so over time, successively, where each molt produces a more gonopod-like appendage, until, by maturity, the gonopods are fully formed and functional. The most primitive living millipede clade with gonopods is the Pentazonia. Like their more basal Polyzonida cousins, the Pentazonia are also short, with similarly few body segments and few pairs of legs. They're also known as pill millipedes, owing to their short, stubby, rounded, cylindrical appearance. Their gonopods are mounted at the rear of the body, instead of the third body segment, which is closer to the head. In contrast, the Helminthamorpha, which is the other clade with gonopods, they have theirs mounted on the 7th body segment, near the upper middle portion of the body, where they can be involved in the intimate process of millipede copulation. It may surprise you to learn that most millipedes, like these helminthamorphs, appear to be sensitive mates, whose behaviors before and during copulation are kind of romantic relative to the rest of the animal kingdom. In many species, the male begins the encounter with foreplay behaviors, including antenna massages, crawling along the female's backside, and feeding her some edible secretions from certain glands. Not the ozapine glands that make caustic chemicals. These are different glands with a more mating-specific purpose. Once the foreplay has been completed and the female is receptive to the male's advances, the millipedes will face each other, bellies pressed together, and the male will heft himself up to get the gonopods on his 7th segment aligned with the genital pores on the female's 3rd segment. The male will use his gonopods to rub the female's genital pores and pull out or unfold some of the internal tissue, the vulvae. Then, the male will transfer sperm from his penis or his own genital pores onto the gonopods, and then places them into the female's opened, semi-unfolded genital tissue. While this insemination process is going on at the mid-body, the male and female are rubbing their antennae and their forelegs against each other's faces in the millipede version of making out. There's another extremely fascinating detail I need to point out here. Across the entire class Diplopoda, virtually nothing makes noise. Not only are they deaf, but they're also almost entirely mute. Millipedes are, for the most part, a silent clade, a group whose member species make virtually no noises. That is, no deliberate noises, like vocalizations or stridulations or something. For the most part, there are exceptions. At least 4 groups within the superorder Orniscomorpha include species that produce sounds. These aren't vocalizations. Instead, they're kind of like a subtype of stridulation, or a chirping noise made by rubbing the carapace plates of their mandibles. It's only made by males, and only in species that can roll into a protective ball. Now remember that the millipedes have no sense of hearing. They're all deaf. There isn't an audio component to their existence. So why then do some of them make noises through stridulation? Well, research has found that the sound itself has no actual part in what's going on here. The sound isn't a functional component of this behavior. It's just a byproduct that we hear. Rather, the purpose of this behavior is to send a series of vibrations that the female can feel, and the frequency of the vibrations informs her that it's safe to engage with the male. This tactic is often used if the female has rolled herself up into a defensive ball and needs to be coaxed out of it. But many species have males that will stridulate during and even after copulation. The specific frequency is dependent on the species and can serve as a species identifier for both female millipedes and the scientists who study them. So to put this another way, in the groups of millipedes that will sometimes roll into a ball to defend themselves, they've developed basically the millipede version of a safe word that takes the form of a certain vibration that they feel, and this lets them know that another member of their species is there, they're receptive, they can come out of their defensive ball and it's safe, and they may even get to have a sexual encounter. Even when copulation is complete and the male and female have parted ways, after an hour or so, some males are known to stridulate once more, to chirp one last time, as if calling out for the love of their life, or the one that got away. However, not all males are so dramatic, despite being quick to leave. In some species, the males may stick around to help rear the offspring. For example, in a very rare case of paternal care in arthropods, male andronathidae millipedes are known to coil around their eggs and newly hatched offspring to keep them warm and safe. Now the females walk away from the sexual encounter with a fertilized clutch of eggs, which can number anywhere from a dozen or so to several hundred, up to 300, depending on the species. Typically, females will lay the eggs in the soil. Some species will build small nests lined with soft and edible organic matter for the eggs, while others will just plop them out when it's most convenient. Maternal care is also pretty rare, but it is exhibited by some groups, particularly the Platydesmida, which includes the paternalistic andronathidae that I mentioned a minute ago. Now after a few weeks, roughly about a month, the eggs will hatch. The newborn larvae are very small, with a mere 3 pairs of legs and 4 end segments with no legs. The body begins to elongate by producing more body segments with every molting event. As the larva goes through its juvenile stages, its juvenile instars, each successive molt will see it get a little larger, with more body segments and more pairs of legs. Part of this growth involves the young millipede eating its own shed exoskeleton, to recapture and reintegrate all of those nutrients and all of the carbon back into its body. This molting-based growth process will repeat as needed until the millipede eventually reaches maturity. Some species, of course, will continue to molt after reaching adulthood, either because they're just still growing larger, they just continually grow larger, or because it's just a cyclical thing that always happens. And when this happens, or how long it takes between molting events, or how many molting events it takes to reach maturity, also varies between species. That's really been a strong undercurrent to pretty much everything I've mentioned today. Despite all millipedes maintaining the same basic body plan, virtually everything else varies from species to species. The size of the antenna, the thickness of the mandibles, the shape of the mouth, the color of the carapace, the shape and the coloration of the diplosegments, the shape and texture of the paranata, the chemical composition of their caustic secretions, their mating behaviors, their feeding behaviors, their defensive behaviors. It all varies in beautiful and wonderfully inventive ways, depending on which species you're looking at. But at the core of it all, we have that consistent, worm-like segmented body form, with pairs of legs protruding from the belly to creep and crawl across the ground. The millipedes are truly an impressive and amazing clade, and this was a really fun episode that tried to examine all aspects of their existence. I hope you enjoyed it and that you learned something really cool, and if you did, then hit the like button or give the show a 5-star review. Become a supporter on Patreon for as low as $1 a month. That's a good deal, right? I think it is, and all of that money helps to support the show. It goes right back into hosting fees, equipment, all that stuff. And it really means the world to me. I'm so grateful and appreciative for all your support. And as always, thank you for listening.